Next up, we're going to dive into the fascinating world of economics and climate policy with a question that's on everyone's mind. Is it morally justifiable for a country to prioritize its economic growth over climate policy? I mean, think about it, folks. We've got politicians like Friedrich Merz suggesting that we need to put the economy first, but what are the potential long-term consequences of such a decision?
Hmm, that's a great question. I'm not sure. I mean, isn't climate change like a huge deal? Don't we need to prioritize that over, economic growth? Right?
Well, let's break it down. On one hand, economic growth can bring many benefits, such as job creation, increased living standards, and improved infrastructure. But on the other hand, prioritizing economic growth over climate policy can have devastating consequences like rising temperatures, more frequent natural disasters, and unpredictable weather patterns.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've heard of this concept called the tragedy of the commons, where individual self-interest can lead to collective ruin. Is that what's happening here? I mean, are countries just prioritizing their own economic interests without considering the global impact?
Exactly. The tragedy of the commons is a perfect analogy for this situation. When countries prioritize their own economic growth over climate policy, they're essentially exploiting a shared resource, the environment, for their own benefit without considering the long-term consequences. It's like a game of musical chairs where everyone's trying to grab a seat, but in the end, we all lose.
Wow, that's a great point. So, what about Merz's suggestion to put the economy before climate? Do you think that's a viable solution?
Well, it's not that simple. While economic growth is important, it can't come at the expense of our planet's well-being. We need to find a balance between economic development and environmental sustainability. Think of it like a seesaw. When one side goes up, the other side has to come down. We need to find that equilibrium.
Right. So, what are some potential long-term consequences of prioritizing economic growth over climate policy? I mean, are we talking about like apocalypse level stuff?
Ha! Well, it's not quite that dramatic, but it's serious nonetheless. Rising temperatures can lead to sea level rise, more frequent natural disasters, and unpredictable weather patterns. This in turn can have devastating effects on food production, human migration, and global stability. It's like a domino effect. Once one thing falls, everything else follows.
Whoa, that's crazy. I didn't realize it was that bad. So, what can we do to avoid this? Is there a way to balance economic growth with climate policy?
Absolutely. We need to adopt sustainable practices, invest in renewable energy, and implement policies that promote environmental protection. It's not a zero-sum game. We can have both economic growth and climate sustainability. In fact, many countries are already doing it, like Norway, which has implemented a carbon tax to reduce emissions while still maintaining a strong economy.
That's really interesting. I didn't know Norway was doing that. So, what about other countries? Are there any examples of countries that have successfully balanced economic growth with climate policy?
Yeah, there are many examples. Costa Rica, for instance, has made significant strides in reforestation and renewable energy while still maintaining a strong economy. And Denmark has implemented a circular economy model which reduces waste and promotes sustainable consumption.
Wow, that's amazing. I had no idea. So, it's not all doom and gloom? There are ways to balance economic growth with climate policy.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance and being proactive. We can't just sit back and wait for someone else to solve the problem. We need to take action, invest in sustainable technologies, and implement policies that promote environmental protection.
Right. So, what can we do as individuals to contribute to this? I mean, it's not just up to governments, right?
Absolutely not. As individuals, we can make a huge difference by changing our daily habits, reducing energy consumption, using public transport, recycling, and supporting sustainable businesses. Every small action counts, and collective action can lead to significant positive change.
That's really inspiring. I think I'm going to start making some changes in my own life. Thanks for explaining this so clearly.
You're welcome. It's a complex issue, but by understanding the complexities and taking action, we can create a more sustainable future for all. And who knows, maybe one day we'll have a world where economic growth and climate sustainability go hand in hand. Wouldn't that be something? Next up, we're discussing the recent comments made by former President Donald Trump regarding NATO and its members' defense spending. Today, we're going to dive into the exciting world of international relations and explore whether Trump's claim that he would not protect a NATO country from Russian invasion if they didn't pay their bills constitutes a legitimate negotiating tactic or undermines the foundation of the alliance. I'm your host, and I'll be guiding you through this complex topic.
Right. So, what exactly did Trump say, and how does it affect NATO's collective defense?
Well, let's break it down. Trump claimed that he told the president of a big NATO country that if they didn't pay their bills, he would not protect them from a Russian invasion. This statement has sparked a lot of debate about the nature of NATO's commitments and the concept of collective defense.
Okay. But doesn't NATO have a rule that members have to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense? Is Trump just trying to enforce that rule?
That's a great question. While it's true that NATO has a guideline for member countries to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense, it's not a hard and fast rule. In fact, the guideline is more of a suggestion, and countries are encouraged to work towards meeting it over time.
I see. So, Trump's claim that NATO members owe the US money is basically false?
Exactly. The idea that NATO members owe the US or NATO itself money is a misconception. The 2% guideline is simply a target for countries to spend on their own defense programs, not a payment to NATO or the US.
Wow, that's really interesting. But what about Trump's negotiating tactic? Is it possible that he was just trying to strong-arm NATO members into increasing their defense spending?
While it's possible that Trump was trying to use his statement as a negotiating tactic, it's also important to consider the potential consequences of such an approach. By suggesting that the US might not come to the defense of a NATO member if they don't meet certain conditions, Trump is essentially undermining the very foundation of the alliance.
Right? Because isn't the whole point of NATO that an attack on one member is an attack on all members?
Exactly. The concept of collective defense is at the heart of NATO's mission. By questioning whether the US would come to the defense of a member country, Trump is creating uncertainty and potentially undermining the trust between member states.
That makes sense. But what about other presidents? Have they also pressured NATO members to increase their defense spending?
Actually, yes. Both President Obama and President Bush before him encouraged NATO members to increase their defense spending. However, they did so in a much more diplomatic and collaborative way, without questioning the fundamental commitment to collective defense.
Oh wow. So, it's not just about the message but also how you deliver it.
Exactly. The tone and approach used by leaders can have a significant impact on how their messages are received. In this case, Trump's confrontational approach has sparked controversy and raised concerns among NATO members.
Right. I think I'm starting to understand. So what about the cost of NATO's headquarters? I've heard Trump claim that it costs $3 billion. Is that true?
Great question. While I don't have the exact figure in front of me, I can tell you that the cost of NATO's headquarters is not the main issue here. The real concern is the potential damage that Trump's comments could do to the alliance and its commitment to collective defense.
Okay. I think I need a bit more time to wrap my head around this. Can we take a quick detour and explore some historical examples of how NATO has worked in practice? Maybe that will help me understand the implications of Trump's comments better?
Absolutely. Let's take a look at some real-world examples of how NATO has operated in the past. For instance, during the Cold War, NATO played a crucial role in deterring Soviet aggression in Europe. More recently, NATO has been involved in various military interventions and peacekeeping missions around the world.
Right. And how do you think Trump's comments might affect future alliances or international agreements?
Well, that's a great question. If leaders start to question the fundamental commitments of an alliance like NATO, it could create uncertainty and mistrust among member states. This, in turn, could have far-reaching consequences for global security and stability.
I see what you mean. It's like if one person in a group says they might not show up to help the others, everyone starts to wonder if they can really count on each other.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for leaders to communicate clearly and consistently about their commitments and expectations. In the case of NATO, the alliance relies on trust and cooperation among its member states to function effectively.
Right. I think I'm starting to get it. So, what's the takeaway from all this? Is Trump's claim a legitimate negotiating tactic or not?
Well, in my opinion, Trump's approach is more likely to undermine the foundation of the alliance than achieve any significant increases in defense spending. By questioning the commitment to collective defense, Trump is creating uncertainty and potentially damaging the trust between member states.
Okay. I think I agree with you. But what do you think about the idea that Trump was just trying to get NATO members to pay their fair share?
While I understand the sentiment behind that idea, I think it's misguided. The issue is not about whether NATO members are paying their fair share, but rather about how we approach the concept of collective defense and cooperation. By framing it as a transactional relationship, where one country only helps another if they've paid their bills, we risk undermining the very foundation of the alliance.
Right. That makes sense. I think I need to think about this some more, but it's been really helpful talking through all these ideas with you.
Absolutely. It's always important to explore complex topics like this from multiple angles and perspectives. And who knows, maybe we'll revisit this topic again in the future and see how things have developed. Next up, we're discussing the highly debated topic of the German debt brake and its implications on the economy. I'm your host, and today we're going to dive into the intricacies of this policy and explore whether it's a necessary measure or a hindrance to economic growth. The German election has brought this issue to the forefront, and investors are eager to see how the new government will approach this topic.
Yeah, I've heard of the debt brake, but I'm not entirely sure what it entails. Can you explain it in simple terms? Is it like a spending cap or something?
Exactly. The debt brake is a constitutional amendment that limits the government's ability to incur new debt. It's designed to prevent reckless spending and ensure fiscal responsibility. However, critics argue that it has held back investment and growth, particularly in infrastructure.
Right. So it's like a self-imposed austerity measure? But isn't that, well, kind of restrictive? I mean, what if the government needs to invest in something critical, like education or healthcare?
That's a great point. Proponents of the debt brake argue that it prevents governments from making rash decisions and accumulating excessive debt. However, opponents claim that it has led to underinvestment in crucial areas, such as infrastructure, which is essential for economic growth.
I see what you mean. But what about the argument that it's helped maintain Germany's strong credit rating? Doesn't that outweigh the potential drawbacks?
Great question. While it's true that the debt brake has contributed to Germany's solid fiscal position, some argue that this comes at the cost of economic growth. For instance, if you look at the chart showing Germany's economy lagging behind Eurozone growth for over a year, where was I? Yes, the chart. It suggests that perhaps the debt brake has been too restrictive.
Wow. Yeah. That's a pretty stark contrast. But what about the potential consequences of abolishing the debt brake altogether? Wouldn't that lead to, reckless spending and inflation?
Not necessarily. Some experts argue that a more flexible approach could allow for targeted investments in areas like infrastructure, education, and research, which would actually boost economic growth and increase tax revenues in the long run.
Okay. I think I'm starting to see both sides of the argument now. But what about the euro? How does it factor into all this?
Great question. The euro is expected to benefit from any increase in government spending that boosts the economic outlook. In fact, Morgan Stanley said that a grand coalition with a two-thirds majority needed for debt brake reforms would likely be euro positive.
Interesting. So, it's all about finding that balance between fiscal responsibility and allowing for enough flexibility to invest in growth-driven initiatives.
Exactly. And that's what makes this topic so fascinating. The German election has brought this issue to the forefront, and investors are eager to see how the new government will approach this delicate balancing act.
Right. I'm starting to get a sense of just how complex this issue is. But hey, can you give me an analogy to help simplify it? Like, maybe something related to personal finance?
Laughs. Well, think of the debt brake like a strict budgeting app that limits your monthly expenses. It might prevent you from overspending, but it also restricts your ability to invest in things that could generate long-term returns, like education or a down payment on a house.
I see what you mean. That makes sense. But what if the budgeting app is too restrictive and doesn't account for unexpected expenses or opportunities? Doesn't that kind of rigid approach ultimately hinder your financial growth?
Smiling. Exactly. And that's the crux of the debate surrounding the German debt brake. Is it a necessary measure to prevent reckless spending, or is it a misguided policy that has stifled economic growth and investment? The answer, much like personal finance, lies in finding that delicate balance. Next up, we're diving into the fascinating and complex world of European geopolitics, specifically exploring how the recent election in Germany could be a game changer for defense spending across the continent, and I'm calling this episode Defense on the Rise, the European Conundrum. We're talking about bond yields, equities, and the potential impact on the economy, but also the ethical implications of prioritizing military buildup over social welfare programs.
That's really interesting. So, you're saying that the German election could lead to more defense spending in Europe? How does that work?
Exactly. With a potential CDU-led coalition, there's anticipation that Germany will increase its defense spending, which could have a ripple effect across Europe. I mean, think of it like a row of dominoes. When one country boosts its military budget, others may feel pressure to follow suit.
Right? And what about the impact on the economy? I've heard that defense spending can actually stimulate growth, but at what cost?
Great question. The relationship between defense spending and economic growth is complex. On one hand, investing in defense can create jobs and drive innovation, like in the case of German arms maker Rheinmetall, which recently surged to record highs. But on the other hand, diverting resources away from social welfare programs could exacerbate income inequality and hurt the most vulnerable members of society.
That's a really good point. I mean, it's like, do you prioritize building tanks or feeding families? It seems like a zero-sum game. Can you give an example of how this has played out in the past?
Well, consider the case of the United States, where increased military spending has been linked to cuts in social programs like Medicaid and food stamps. It's a classic trade-off between guns and butter, as the saying goes.
I see. And what about the role of NATO in all this? Do they have a say in how much European countries should spend on defense?
Yes. NATO has a target of 2% of GDP for defense spending, which some countries like Germany are striving to meet. But the question is, will this lead to an arms race? And what are the implications for global stability? It's like trying to solve a puzzle. You move one piece, and it affects the entire picture.
That's a really good analogy. I'm starting to see how complex this issue is. What about the potential impact on equities? I've heard that investors are already front-running the results of the election.
Exactly. The markets are anticipating a boost in German economy-exposed stocks if corporate tax cuts and stronger growth follow. But, as Barclays head of European equity strategy Emmanuel Kaz said, this election is more of a positive tail risk than a negative one, so investors may be in for a surprise.
Wow. That's really interesting. I'm starting to think about the potential consequences of all this. Could we see a shift in the global balance of power?
Now we're getting into some really intriguing territory. The implications of increased defense spending in Europe are far-reaching, and it's like trying to predict a chain reaction. You never know exactly how things will play out. But one thing is certain, the ethics of prioritizing military buildup over social welfare programs will be a topic of heated debate for years to come.
I'm getting a bit lost. Can you explain it in simpler terms? Like, what's the main takeaway from all this?
Well, think of it like this. Imogen, you're on a budget and you have to choose between buying groceries or a new TV. That's basically what European countries are facing, but instead of groceries and TVs, it's social welfare programs versus defense spending.
Right. I think I understand now. And what about the role of other countries in all this? Like, how will the US or China react to increased defense spending in Europe?
Great question. The US has been pushing for Europe to increase its defense spending, especially with the ongoing Ukraine conflict. But China's reaction is less clear. They might see it as a threat or an opportunity to expand their own influence in the region.
That's really interesting. I'm starting to see how this is all connected. Can you give another example of how increased defense spending could impact the economy?
Well, consider the case of the US defense industry, which has created thousands of jobs and driven innovation in fields like aerospace and cybersecurity. But at the same time, it's also led to criticisms of waste and inefficiency, like the F-35 fighter jet program, which has been plagued by cost overruns and delays.
Right? I see what you mean. It's like, there are no easy answers here. Every decision has unintended consequences.
Exactly. The world of defense spending is full of trade-offs and nuances. But one thing is certain, the next few months will be crucial in shaping the future of European defense policy, and we'll be keeping a close eye on it.
I'm excited to see how this all plays out. And I have to ask, What's the most surprising thing you've learned about defense spending in Europe?
That's a great question. For me, it's been the complexity of the issue. There are so many factors at play, from NATO targets to national interests. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with moving pieces.
Right. I think I'm starting to get it. And finally, what's the one thing you hope listeners take away from this conversation?
Well, I hope they understand that defense spending is not just about numbers and budgets, it's about people's lives and the choices we make as a society. It's like, do we prioritize building a stronger military, or do we invest in our communities and social welfare programs? The answer is not always easy, but it's a conversation we need to have.